Somewhere off the coast of a small Pacific island called Yap, there is a massive stone disk sitting on the ocean floor, lost during a storm more than a century ago while being transported by canoe. Nobody has ever recovered it, nobody is even entirely sure exactly where it sits. And it is, by the actual functioning economic customs of the island it belongs to, still perfectly valid spendable wealth. The families who own shares of that stone can still trade its value, still use it to settle debts, still treat it as real, meaningful savings, because everyone on the island simply remembers and agrees that it exists, and who it currently belongs to. That single fact should completely rearrange how you think about this entire question. Saving wealth was never really about physically holding onto an object at all. It was about solving a much harder, more interesting problem. How do you make something hold its value reliably? Across months, years, sometimes entire lifetimes. In a world with no banks, no coins, and no paper promising you anything, ancient humans found several genuinely different answers, and every single one of them had to survive the same brutal set of tests. Before looking at the actual solutions, it is worth understanding the problem itself, because it is considerably harder than it sounds. Anything functioning as a store of savings needs to clear several distinct hurdles simultaneously. It needs to be durable enough to survive the passage of time without rotting, rusting, or simply falling apart. It needs to be difficult enough to fake, steal, or duplicate that other people can trust its value is real. And ideally, it needs to hold or even grow in value rather than quietly losing worth the longer it sits there. Modern money, in the form of a bank balance, mostly outsources all three of these problems to an institution and a legal system most people never think about directly. Ancient humans had no such institution to lean on. Every single store of value they developed had to solve these problems directly, using whatever physical, biological, or social tools were actually available to them. Which is exactly why the solutions that emerged turn out to be so wildly different from each other, and so revealing about the specific environment and society that produced them. Grain is one of the oldest, most fundamental answers to this problem, and also one of the most fragile. A genuine tension that ancient societies had to engineer their way around directly. A good harvest produces far more grain than a household needs immediately, creating an obvious opportunity: store the surplus, now consume it later, during the inevitable lean months or a genuinely bad season down the road. The problem is that grain, left unprotected, doesn't just sit there quietly holding its value, it rots. It gets eaten by rodents and insects. It absorbs moisture and grows mold, turning a season's worth of hard-earned savings into something actively dangerous to eat within a surprisingly short window of time. Ancient societies developed real, dedicated engineering specifically to solve this exact storage problem. Raised granaries, built up off the ground on stilts or platforms, protected stored grain from ground moisture and made it considerably harder for rodents to access. Sealed underground storage pits, carefully lined and covered, created a low-oxygen environment that could meaningfully slow spoilage and insect activity. Archaeological evidence from ancient Mesopotamia shows temple and palace institutions managing genuinely enormous grain storage operations, functioning as something remarkably close to an early public bank. Grain deposited, tracked, and later distributed or loaned out, all recorded on clay tablets using a real working system of numerical accounting, centuries before anyone in the region minted an actual coin. Grain storage worked, but only within real limits. It solved durability reasonably well for a season or two, but it never solved growth. A bushel of stored grain in year 3 was, at absolute best, still just a bushel of grain, assuming none of it had rotted away. In the meantime, livestock solved a problem grain fundamentally couldn't: growth. A herd of animals, unlike a stored pile of grain, has the genuinely remarkable property of increasing in size and value entirely on its own, simply by continuing to live and reproduce. This gave livestock something functionally very close to what a modern economist would recognize as compound interest, wealth that grows over time without requiring the owner to do anything beyond basic ongoing care, a genuinely powerful advantage no static, non-living store of value could ever match. A family with a herd of 10 cattle could reasonably expect, assuming decent luck with disease, weather, and predators, to have considerably more than 10 cattle several years later. their original savings having quietly grown all on its own in the background of ordinary daily life. This wasn't a minor detail. In many ancient and traditional pastoral societies, herd size functioned as the single most direct visible measure of a family's accumulated wealth and financial security, a living, walking, breathing savings account that could be drawn down gradually when needed, and animals sold or traded here and there without liquidating the entire fund all at once. But livestock carried its own serious risks in exchange for that growth potential. Disease could wipe out a herd in a single bad season. Theft was a constant real danger, and drought or harsh winters could kill animals faster than any owner could realistically protect against. Unlike a buried object sitting quietly and passively underground, livestock wealth required constant, active management and constant exposure to real biological and environmental risk. The price paid for the one property grain alone could never offer. This brings us to one of the more genuinely fascinating pieces of physical evidence for ancient saving behavior: the buried hoard. Archaeologists across Europe and beyond have discovered thousands of documented hoards, deliberately buried caches of valuable objects, coins, jewelry, metal ingots, precious objects, hidden underground or in other concealed locations, clearly placed there on purpose, with clear intent to retrieve them again later. Bronze Age hoards found across large parts of Europe frequently contain valuable metal objects, weapons, tools, ornaments, sometimes deliberately broken or bent before burial, a practice researchers still actively debate the meaning of, ranging from practical scrap, metal recycling stock, to genuine ritual or religious offering. Viking Age hoards, particularly well documented across parts of Britain and Scandinavia, frequently contain silver, sometimes in coin form, sometimes as simple cut fragments of silver jewelry and ingots, valued directly by weight rather than by any stamped guaranteed denomination. A system historians call hack silver, essentially treating precious metal as a physical, weighable store of value in its own right, independent of any government-backed coinage system. Here is the genuinely haunting detail underlying almost every one of these archaeological discoveries. The overwhelming majority of documented hoards were never recovered by whoever originally buried them. Someone at some point in the distant past dug a hole, carefully buried a portion of their real, hard-earned savings, fully intending to return for it later, and for reasons archaeology can only guess at: sudden death, forced displacement, violent conflict, simple forgotten location, they never did. Every single unrecovered hoard sitting in a museum case today represents a specific individual ancient person's genuine, functioning savings plan, interrupted permanently, mid-execution, by something we will almost certainly never be able to identify with any certainty at all. Not every ancient society solved the record, keeping side of savings using physical objects meant to be exchanged directly. The Inca Empire developed something considerably stranger and arguably more sophisticated, an entire accounting system built from knotted string. The quipu, a device made from a series of colored cords hanging from a central cord with information encoded through the type position, and number of knots tied into each individual strand, functioned as a genuine working system for recording quantities, including stored grain reserves, livestock counts, and tribute owed to or by specific households and regions across the empire. Trained specialists called quipu kamayaks were responsible for creating, reading, and maintaining these records, essentially serving as professional accountants for an empire that remarkably never developed a conventional written script in the way many other major ancient civilizations did. Modern researchers studying surviving quipu, several hundred of which have been recovered and preserved, have confirmed they could encode genuinely precise numerical information using a base 10 positional system, sophisticated enough to track real administrative and economic data across an empire stretching for thousands of miles along the Andes. This matters enormously for the broader question this video is asking, because a quipu wasn't wealth itself, the way a buried hoard or a herd of cattle was. It was something closer to the record of wealth, a physical, durable, remarkably compact way of tracking exactly how much grain, livestock, or other stored value a household or region legitimately held without needing to physically move or display any of the actual goods being counted. In its own way, it solved the same fundamental problem. Yap's Ricestones would later solve on the other side of the world, proving that reliable, trusted record, Keeping could function as a genuine store of value, entirely separate from whatever physical form the underlying wealth actually took. Shell money offers yet another completely different solution to the same underlying problem. One built specifically around durability and difficulty of counterfeiting rather than growth or bulk storage capacity. Cowrie shells, small, glossy, naturally shaped shells originating primarily from the Indian Ocean and Pacific regions, were used as a genuine functioning medium of savings and exchange across enormous stretches of Africa and Asia, in some regions for well over 1,000 years. Cowries had real practical advantages as a store of value. They're naturally durable, resistant to rot or decay in a way grain never could be difficult for anyone to counterfeit convincingly using available ancient technology, and small enough to be accumulated, counted, and stored in real quantity without requiring the constant active management a herd of livestock demanded. Across North America, dentalium shells, and among various northeastern indigenous nations, wampum shell beads carefully worked and often woven into belts, functioned as both a genuine store of value and a socially significant, sometimes ceremonially important object, with specific woven wampum patterns in some documented traditions carrying recorded meaning, treaty terms, and formal agreements, alongside their more straightforward economic function as accumulated tradable wealth. These shell-based systems solve durability and counterfeit resistance remarkably well, better in some respects than grain or livestock ever could. What they didn't solve was livestock's other major advantage. A stored pile of shells, no matter how large, wasn't going to grow larger on its own while sitting untouched in storage. Some ancient societies pushed durability and counterfeit resistance even further, prioritizing a third property almost as important as the first two: value density, how much wealth a person could physically carry or conceal in the smallest possible space. Baltic amber, traded across enormous distances in the ancient world and found in archaeological sites thousands of miles from its northern European origin, offered exactly this kind of concentrated, portable value, light enough to carry in real quantity, durable enough to survive centuries of handling and trade, and rare enough outside its specific region of origin to hold serious value wherever it eventually arrived. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue semi-precious stone quarried almost exclusively in a single region of what is now Afghanistan during the ancient period, shows up in archaeological finds as far away as Egypt and Mesopotamia. Evidence of savings. In a very real sense, being deliberately converted into a form specifically chosen because it could survive an extremely long journey without losing any of its value along the way. This is worth pausing on because it highlights something the grain pits and livestock herds discussed earlier simply couldn't offer: true portability. A family's entire savings, held as amber or lapis lazuli, could be picked up and carried across a continent in a small pouch in a way a herd of cattle or a granary full of stored barley never realistically could. Which brings us back to that stone at the bottom of the ocean off Yap, and the genuinely strangest, most conceptually revealing store of value in this entire story. Rye stones, the traditional stone currency of Yap, are large, sometimes genuinely enormous circular discs carved from limestone, quarried on a distant island and transported historically at real risk and real cost back to Yap by canoe. Because the largest raw sea stones can weigh several tons, they were frequently never physically moved again once they arrived and were assigned an owner. They simply stayed exactly where they were first placed, sometimes propped prominently in a village. Sometimes, as the story that opened this video demonstrates, lost entirely during transport, and never seen again at all. Ownership and value in this system were tracked and enforced almost entirely through shared community memory and oral history, rather than through any actual physical possession or control of the object itself. Everyone in the relevant community simply knew and collectively agreed on which family currently held a claim to which specific stone, a claim that could be formally transferred during a transaction, even though the stone itself never physically moved an inch. The economist Milton Friedman, writing about Yap's rye stones in the 20th century, specifically used this system to illustrate a genuinely important broader point about the actual nature of money and savings in any economy. Ancient or modern, that value was never really located in the physical object being saved at all. It was located in the shared collective social agreement about who owned what, a system of trusted communal bookkeeping that turns out to underlie essentially every store of value discussed in this entire video, whether that trust was built around a stone nobody could move, a hoard nobody but the owner knew was buried, or a herd everybody in the village could see grazing in a nearby field. So how did ancient humans actually save wealth without money? They built several genuinely different systems, each one solving a different piece of the same underlying puzzle, and each one paying a real specific cost in exchange for whatever advantage it offered. Grain solved abundance, but never solved decay, a savings account with a strict, unavoidable expiration date built directly into it. Livestock solved growth, wealth that could genuinely compound on its own, in exchange for accepting constant risk from disease, theft, and weather. Buried hoards solved concealment and portability of value across time. At the permanent risk, borne out again and again in the archaeological record, of simply never making it back to reclaim what had been so carefully hidden away. The Inca quipu solved something none of the others could, proving that the record of wealth could function as a genuine store of value in its own right, entirely separate from whatever physical form the underlying goods actually took. Shell money solved durability and counterfeit resistance about as well as anything in the ancient world managed to, in exchange for offering no growth potential of its own. Amber and lapis lazuli solved true portability, saving small and light enough to survive a journey of thousands of miles without losing a fraction of their worth. Andiap's rye stones solved something even more fundamental than any of the others, proving that a store of value never actually needed a physical form at all, as long as an entire community was willing to remember and agree on exactly who it belonged to. We didn't invent the concept of savings when we invented banks and coins. We just finally built an institution capable of doing, reliably and at enormous scale, what ancient grain pits, ancient herds, ancient buried hoards, and one enormous stone sitting quietly at the bottom of the ocean had already been doing, in their own limited, imperfect, remarkably clever ways for thousands of years before any of us got here.